First of all, in Ottawa, we meet on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Here in Hamilton East Stony Creek, we have the territorial lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Chinantan nations. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted on April 29th, 2021, the committee is continuing its study of enforcement on First Nations reserves. To ensure an orderly meeting, would I remind our guests, participants may speak and listen in the official language of your choice. You select that on the globe in the bottom center of your screen, and you can select floor, English, or French, whatever one you select. As you're presenting, if you change from one language to another, there's no need to change the technology. You can simply switch languages. When speaking, ensure that your video is turned on, and please speak slowly and clearly. And when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. And pursuant to the motion adopted on March 9th, 2021, I must inform the committee that all witnesses have completed a technical pretest. Now, with us today for the first hour by video conference are the following witnesses. From the RCMP, Staff Sergeant Ryan Howe, Detachment Commander, Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. Inspector Jeff Preston, Officer in Charge, Campbell River, British Columbia. Inspector Dustin Rusk, the Officer in Charge of Indigenous Relations Services. And hopefully soon we will have Amishai Wise, the Counsel from Legal Services. Thank you all for appearing with us today. And so with opening remarks, if Mr. Inspector Preston, do you have the remarks in front of you?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead, 6 minutes.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us today. My name is Jeff Preston. I'm the officer in charge of Campbell River Detachment in Vancouver Island, British Columbia. I'm speaking on behalf of Inspector Dustin Rusk from RCMP Indigenous Relations Services. He's having technical difficulty, so I'm going to read his opening remarks on his behalf. I'd like to start off by recognizing that I presently am speaking from the traditional territories of Weewilkai, Weewilkum, and Hamalkal First Nations here in beautiful Vancouver Island. The RCMP has an important role, along with other government and non-governmental agencies, to support the enhanced safety and well-being of Indigenous communities. It is one of the RCMP strategic priorities. It is important for all frontline enforcement service providers, including the police, to be kept abreast of any legal or legislative developments and involving aspects of Indigenous legal matters that are pertinent to law enforcement activities for Indigenous communities. The RCMP, as well as other policing service providers, works in partnership with the ministries that are responsible for the safety and well-being of Indigenous communities. The RCMP supports the need for enforcement of First Nation reserves or on First Nation reserves in relation to COVID-19 measures to control the spread of the disease, and will continue to engage with the leaders of Indigenous communities where the RCMP is the police service of jurisdiction. At the onset of the pandemic, the importance of enforcing ban-created bylaws related to COVID-19 became acute. The RCMP response was to work with Indigenous communities, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, known as PPSC, and other partners to find ways that was lawful and respectful. Under the Section 81 and Section 85 of the Indian Act, First Nation communities may establish ban bylaws relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic. Of particular relevance, Section 81 sub 1 sub A, which states that the ban bylaw may be passed to provide for the health of residents on the reserve and to prevent the spreading of contagious and infectious diseases. When an investigation is warranted, the RCMP will investigate and determine if there are reasonable grounds to lay a charge under a ban bylaw. Generally speaking, ban bylaws are treated as federal laws that are enforceable by the RCMP, the police of jurisdiction, or ban bylaw enforcement officers. A contravention of a ban bylaw is a summary conviction offense. The offense and circumstances will determine appropriate form of release, appearance notice, undertaking, or summons. RCMP personnel continue to exercise judgment and operational discretion to enforce the COVID-19 related ban bylaws in accordance with relevant statutory and constitutional law, as well as national and divisional policies. RCMP personnel may consult the regional PPSC office for a Crown opinion if there is any questions or concerns of whether charges are warranted or supported. With respect to COVID-19 related ban bylaws, First Nation communities may elect to explore entering into a prosecution and enforcement protocol agreement with the PPSE, regional office, and the local law enforcement, often the RCMP, for the enforcement of a specific bylaw that rely on Section 81 and or 85 sub 1 of the Indian Act as a legal authority. There are several published examples of this protocol approach currently in effect where the RCMP is involved, as well as other police agencies. A key example of this emanates from British Columbia, where a protocol was signed into effect in January 2021 with the Cowichan tribes, which is in Duncan, British Columbia. This protocol sets out a procedure for the investigation by the RCMP and a prosecution by the PPSE of offenses set out in bylaws adopted by Cowichan tribes and specifically enforced to address the COVID-19 pandemic through the bylaws. A significant item of this protocol is the aspect to consider restorative justice. Before submitting a report to Crown for charge approval, the RCMP will consider whether the matter is appropriate for diversion to the Cowichan Tribes Restorative Justice Program. As Indigenous communities continue to deal with the pandemic and protect its members, the RCMP will continue to work with these communities in a collaborative manner and prioritize their safety. Thank you for having us today, and we look forward to your questions.
Inspector, thank you very much for that presentation. And we are going to go on now to a round of questioning, 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Vidal. Gary, please go ahead for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses from the RCMP today. We do appreciate you taking the time and joining us so that we can learn from your experience and your knowledge as we consider this study on enforcement in First Nation communities. And we look forward to the advice you can offer to us as we develop a report and bring recommendations forward to the House of Commons. I'm going to focus my questions on Staff Sergeant Howe this morning, just because we have some history and a relationship. And Staff Sergeant Howe, I think you have a unique opportunity to offer advice to us. If I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you grew up in a northern community that had many First Nations kind of surrounding where you grew up, and your entire time in the force has been serving in northern Saskatchewan communities where you have shared borders with a town and First Nations, a village and First Nations, and now I think the detachment you command now serves a small city, a rural municipality, a couple of First Nations, and a Métis community as well. So my question for you is, with that unique experience, what lessons could you share with the members of this committee on the things you have learned and successful enforcement in First Nations communities with that kind of perspective of neighboring relationships and communities?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. That's correct. I grew up in Saskatchewan, northern Saskatchewan, and been fortunate enough to be posted here my entire service. Many of the communities I've worked in have First Nations communities literally separated by a hedgerow from non-First Nations communities. One thing I've learned dealing with the leadership on those First Nations communities is they feel that inequity, that they aren't in control of some of the laws and requesting the enforcement that the non-First Nation community is able to enact under their own bylaws. In my current situation, I am managing a municipal policing contract for a city, provincial contract for the RM, 2 CTAs, and a Métis community. So very, very unique communities with unique demands, all in a very small geographic area. But even our 2 First Nations, Waterhen and Flying Dust, though they're only 60 kilometers apart, they're very different communities, but the ability for them to tailor laws and enact their own bylaws causes some frustration for them, being unique communities. Flying Dust is, again, right next to Meadow Lake, the city that we police. So they're essentially one community, but very, very different policing aspects and very different approaches from our young members when they're responding to calls on the different communities. If that answers your question, I'll leave it at there.
Thank you. Could I maybe just get you to expand on the lessons you've learned that have allowed you to be successful in that relationship? And in my preamble, I never expressed the one comment I was going to make, and I'm not sure I ever shared this with you, Staff Sergeant, but when you were transferred out of one of those communities, I actually had the chief of that neighboring First Nation reach out to me and then express his disappointment on losing your leadership in that community. So I don't do this to stroke your ego. That's not my point. But you obviously learned some things, that you were successful in building relationships with those communities. And I'd be interested in just kind of hearing some more about what works and what are the positive things you've learned that work in the First Nations policing.
Sure. I guess then I'll go back to some experience I've had on the negative. Some of the First Nations leaders and all community leaders have told me that for quite a few years they felt the RCMP told them what their policing needs were. So to reverse that around and approach the community leaders and have them tell us what their needs are, because the community knows best. So I think the one lesson, the biggest lesson I take from that is approaching policing in a community, in any community, with humility and open communication, and listen to what the community wants. What we may feel as a detachment as a policing priority may not be recognized as what the community wants. So unless there's that communication, we're not understanding, and then there's a complete disconnect. So as hard as the RCMP may be working to achieve goals that they feel are important for the community, they may be missing the mark on what the community wants. So humility and communication were the two lessons I've taken away from all the communities I've worked in.
Thank you. I'm going to switch over quickly for just a minute here to Inspector Preston and ask him basically the same question. Inspector Preston, if you would just respond to your experience and what works in policing in a First Nation community, and just add to maybe what Staff Sergeant Howe shared with us.
Thank you very much for the question. Not to copy Staff Sergeant Howe, but I too find the best way to make a positive difference in any of the First Nation communities that I've worked in, which have been many, is to have open, honest communication with the officials and the public at large, listening to what they want, what they need, and then working with them to try and accomplish that. Because a lot of the aspects of policing become legal and are hard to understand. So if you work together so that everyone has a common understanding of what needs to happen in order to get to the desired goal, is the best way moving forward.
And that's just about time, Gary. Thank you. Pam, 6 minutes. Ms. Demoff, please go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks to our witnesses for being here today. And outside of Ontario and Quebec, the RCMP are contracted by provincial and sometimes municipal governments. And so there's often confusion from Canadians that the federal government is actually directing the RCMP when they're in First Nations communities outside Ontario and Quebec. So could you maybe, I know there's a tripartite table that is established, but in terms of where the RCMP is receiving their direction in provincial, I think you're from, we've got Saskatchewan and British Columbia here, but regardless of the province, could you maybe explain that to us a little bit?
I don't mind taking this question, Staff Sergeant Howe. Within any of the contract provinces, so essentially outside of Ontario and Quebec, the policing is a responsibility of the provincial government. With regard to policing on reserve, it is a provincial responsibility, but the RCMP obviously has to uphold all statutes and regulations that apply to that province. But every year we do approach the First Nation communities, ask them to sign a letter of understanding or letter of expectation as to what they would like the main priorities to be for that coming year. And we also will meet throughout the year to determine if those priorities are being met, and if not, how we can better approach things. From year to year, sometimes those expectations do not change. A lot of times it's to deal with drug dealers on reserve or people coming onto the reserve to sell drugs, alcohol.
So can I stop you there just for a second though? But because you're contracted by the province, so it's not like the federal government is providing direction to you directly. It's the provincial government who's contracted you. But I want to go back to the drug dealer that you just mentioned, because you said the RCMP can enforce bylaws on reserve. Is that right?
Certain bylaws, yes. And this is part of the problem because some
So we've got a drug dealer on a reserve and the reserve wants to lay charges. Who do they call and what's the process? Because we know it's not just during COVID. This has been an issue that's been ongoing. So could you maybe go through what the process is for that and where the barriers are?
So with regard to, for example, drug dealing, that is a criminal code or a Controlled Drugs and Substances Act offense. So that's a federal statute, fairly easy. That is, you call the RCMP or police of jurisdiction for that area, and then we would do our investigation. The issue becomes if we're not successful in gathering enough evidence to support a charge under the CDSA or criminal code, a lot of times the First Nation communities would like to get rid of that individual off reserve, and then we have to start dealing with banned bylaws, which we may or may not even exist, and if they do exist, whether or not they actually are enforceable by the RCMP.
So even when you have enough to lay a charge, we heard from the Public Prosecution Service of Canada that there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of the prosecutions, and some communities have had to hire private prosecutors. So even if you're able to get enough evidence, you're saying that will always result in a prosecution?
So I think it's very important to differentiate between a criminal matter and a bylaw matter. A criminal matter, if we have enough evidence, we here in British Columbia, at least, I know it's different in some contract provinces, we will forward all the information to the prosecutor who will determine whether or not a charge is approved. That's for criminal code or CDSA federal statute. Bylaws, the disconnect is in most cases, Public Prosecutions Canada will not prosecute. They will have the individual bands hire lawyers to act as the prosecutor, which becomes very expensive. And you can well imagine for some communities of 100 or so individuals, it's just unattainable because the costs are prohibitive.
So do you have any recommendations on how we could make it easier for these communities to enforce their bylaws?
Well, I kind of look at it as a spoke or a wheel. There's spokes. Some of those spokes are the enforcement folks like myself. Other spokes on that wheel are Public Prosecutions Canada, and the spoke is obviously the First Nation community itself who would want to enact that law. If all those spokes aren't working together, the wheel is going to be flat and it's not going to work. It's not going to roll. We need to have a system in place where it's not cost prohibitive for First Nations communities to have their bylaws enacted and enforced. And enforcement coming from, meaning the prosecution of it, the RCMP, if properly funded and staffed, could have the ability to enforce those laws, but that's only one thing. Enforcement.
So I only have 30 seconds left. In Ontario right now, there's conversations to try and come up with a solution. Do you see that as being something that would be helpful across Canada to bring all these parties to the table to say, how do we resolve these issues?
Anytime we can get all the partners at one table talking is definitely a positive step.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks so much. Mr. Clerk, I see Mr. Wise has joined the panel. Are we good with the sound check?
Well, if you would like to unmute and perhaps introduce himself and let us know where he's calling from, the interpreters will let me know.
Mr. Wise, can you go ahead? Go.
Good day, Mr. Chair. My apologies. Apparently, these technical issues were beyond my control. So again, my apologies, and thank you for having me here today.
I'll ask him just to move his microphone up between mouth and nose level, and I think we'll be okay going forward.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Good to go, Mr. Clerk? Okay. And Mr. Wise, thanks for joining us now. And we go now to Madam Berube, 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm on the traditional territory of the Cree in northern Quebec, so you'll understand that when it comes to the RCMP, this doesn't come under their jurisdiction. But what is your real mandate with respect to the provincial contracts and the communities, and where is the limit between between the two?
I'm sorry, I was a little bit garbled in my ear. I'm sorry. Could I get the question repeated?
Yes, I wanted to know what is your role and what is your mandate with respect to provincial contracts and Aboriginal communities, and where does the limit lie between the RCMP and the provinces?
Thank you for the question. Again, if Staff Sergeant Howe wants to jump in at any time, feel free. But our mandate from a provincial standpoint is to enforce all federal, provincial, and statutes within the province that we're contractually obligated to provide policing services to, including First Nation communities. So it's important to note that we do go see each First Nation community, and not each community has a community tripartite agreement. So it is imperative on detachment commanders to go to each community to get to know the community and to understand what the needs are for that community in regards to policing.
Quels sont les problèmes?
What types of problems have you come up against with respect to the relationship that you have in this process?
Thank you for the question. Some of the problems that I've personally experienced is the fact that we do transfer around a lot, and like has been mentioned by Staff Sergeant Howe and myself, that relationship building is imperative. So when we have detachment commanders or personnel in the detachments that move frequently, it takes time to develop relationships, to develop that trust. Everyone on this call can well imagine there has been mistrust by First Nation communities to the RCMP and any other policing agency. I mean, in the past, police have been used to enforce the government policy of the day, such as residential schools, and that has led to years of mistrust, understandably so, and it takes time to break down those barriers. So having time with your communities and understanding their needs has been a major hurdle, as well as having bylaws and regulations that are enforceable in some cases and non-enforceable in others. And it's very confusing for the communities as a whole, not to mention the members that are actually enforcing those laws.
With the pandemic, there has also obviously been some problems. What about trust? What about the trust that you have between the police department and the communities?
I might be able to chime in on this one. I think, again, it comes back to the relationship between the detachments and the communities. And you had previously asked about difficulties enforcing on the First Nation or any conflicts. And in my experience, when a provincial legislation such as the Wildlife Act comes against what may be considered a overstep on treaty rights, then we've definitely come into some conflicts there between different legislations. And similar to dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, it all comes on relationships and being able to mediate those concerns with the detachment. Usually the detachment commander and the detachment members working out solutions before it becomes a bigger issue. And I relay that back to the COVID-19 pandemic because we were very sympathetic and concerned that cultural activities still be able to take place on the First Nations within the public health order.
Vous avez parlé plus tôt aussi.
You said that you had signed letters of understanding. Are these agreements able to let you do your job?
Again, each community is different, so not all communities have signed agreements with regard to COVID-19. Each community, and not each community even has a community tripartite agreement or a CTA. The communities that I service do have that agreement in place for the CTA at least, but we do not have a COVID-19 bylaw, although we do work closely with each of the nations here. I believe we've built up a level of trust and understanding. And when there has been issues in specifically surrounding COVID-19, we've been able to effectively mediate it. There has been, some bumps in the road, but it's through those relationships that's made the difference, not the bylaws in my experience.
Thank you for the responses. And we go now for 6 minutes to Ms. Blaney. Rachel.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for your presentation today. It's been very helpful and the questions that you've answered. If I could come to you first, Inspector Preston. You spoke in your introduction about the fact that you have 3 First Nations territories that you work upon. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about, in your experience, what are some of the hurdles or concerns you have when enforcing the various statutes, regulations, as well as bylaws and laws in First Nations communities? And can you also add that context of how do you deal with 3 different communities and the challenges that might present?
Thank you for the question. As I've stated, in each contract province that the RCMP is the police of jurisdiction, there's over 100 statutes and regulations that we're expected to enforce. Unfortunately, not all of those regulations or statutes are applicable on reserve. I'll give an example here in British Columbia. The BC Motor Vehicle Act, pretty standard act, is not applicable on all roads within reserve. So for example, one of the communities here, on one of the roads going into the community, the Motor Vehicle Act applies. But as soon as you turn off onto a different road, still on the same reserve, it doesn't apply. So it becomes very difficult. I mean, the officers this is what we do for a living, so we get to know where we can and cannot apply the law, but it becomes very difficult to explain to the general public. And it builds mistrust when a member of the community calls and says, hey, so-and-so is driving, they know they're not supposed to be. And we say, well, actually, that doesn't apply on that road. Please call us when they actually go over to a different road. Like I say, it's very difficult to explain to the general public and becomes, leads to mistrust and a loss of community confidence in their law enforcement. With regard to banned bylaws, it becomes even more difficult because of all the things we've talked about already about what it takes to enact the law itself for the chief and council to actually come up with the law, because they have to work with lawyers. It costs be very expensive. And then it becomes the enforcement. Who will enforce it? And if we do enforce it, what mechanism do we have in place for a dispute? So if someone disputes the fact that they were breaking the bylaw, who is going to hear that? Who's going to be the prosecutor? Who's going to be the judge? It all becomes very complicated, and a lot of times communities just do not have the capacity to roll with that.
Thank you. And I guess this is part of my frustration. I keep hearing this part about relationship, and I really respect the work that so many people, so many RCMP are doing to do that outreach. But I've also heard from the communities that I represent that they'll have somebody in place that they really trust, they really feel comfortable with. I think Mr. Vidal talked about that with Staff Sergeant Howe, and when they leave, it really breaks apart that core relationship. And so it's always this job of rebuilding. So I'm not sure if you have a solution to that, but I'm just wondering about how is their development in the RCMP about how to build these relationships? Is there systems actually coming into place to work on that?
I don't know if Staff Sergeant Howe wants to touch base, but I can quickly speak. I mean, we do have some training, but one of the biggest thing is, like I said, those individual relationships. And the hope is that, yes, we do transfer around. That's just the nature of our work, that the trust is there, that if I leave and I'm a trusted member, the next person coming in can build upon that relationship, and they're not starting at ground zero. When you have a breakdown in that relationship, like we've had in the past, due to the enforcement of unpopular or unjust laws like the residential schools, it takes a long time to start building up those relationships. And we hope that people start to see past the uniform and see the individual that's wearing the uniform, and know that they can trust that person and not rely or dwell on the fact that a uniform may have had a bad experience with that uniform in the past. But with regard to how do we fix transferring around, I don't have an answer for that.
So can you tell me about a time that you worked with a First Nation community to implement an Indian Act bylaw, and how easy was it, and was it successful?
So I've been policing now, thank you for the question, but I've been policing now for 25 years, and in every one of the detachments that I've served, I've had the privilege of working with First Nation communities, both treated and non-treated. This has afforded me the opportunity to work with First Nations on enacting Indian Act bylaws. I'd like to say it's been an enjoyable procedure, but it has not. It's been fraught with a lot of issues. As an example, I worked with a First Nation community here on the West Coast with an intoxicant bylaw. The community has been long suffering from alcoholism, and they wanted to rid the community of alcohol. And sitting down, it was a 3-year, I was there for 3 years. It took over 3 years to just get it to the point where they could vote on it. Some of the pitfalls were the community did not have the legal expertise to draft the bylaw, so they ended up having to utilize outside legal services, which were very expensive for a community that did not have a lot of money. And then from that point forward, they also didn't have the capacity to have the dispute mechanism in place. So at the end of the day, even though the law was passed, it becomes somewhat unenforceable, because for the police to enforce it, we have to have a mechanism for someone to dispute. And when it isn't there, it falls apart. And they did not have the support, I guess, of public prosecutions to prosecute that bylaw.
Thank you. I think that's my time, Chair.
I seem to be having technical issues in this decade. Anyway, thanks, Ms. Blaney. Moving now to the 5-minute round, we have Mr. Vidal, Mr. Batiste, and so on. So, Gary, 5 minutes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to follow up a little bit on some of the stuff that Ms. Damoff did around the prosecutions, and we've heard this kind of threaded throughout the testimony. And I want to start with Staff Sergeant Howe on this, because we've had some conversations about this in the past. Last week, we also heard from a number of department officials about some of the challenges around prosecution. And as I listened to the testimony, I think it was last Thursday, if I can keep my days straight, I immediately wrote down the words jurisdictional quagmire was kind of my response to the testimony. And I don't do this in any, I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. That's not my purpose, but Staff Sergeant Howe, I just, in your experience, both policing on and off reserve, can you just share some of your experiences with the challenges, the frustrations of that kind of enforcement followed up by appropriate prosecution on or off reserve in your experience in these small northern Saskatchewan communities?
Yes, thank you. I think I can go back to prior to 2014 when I was living even further north on a First Nation, and we were able to enforce bylaws pursuant to the Indian Act. The First Nation was very pleased with that, especially it was a dry reserve. We're able to do our best to keep alcohol off the First Nation, which of course cuts down on serious offenses afterwards. After 2014, we weren't able to enforce the bylaws anymore. And that caused an immediate friction between all of the police who were seen as the ones who suddenly stopped. And it was perceived as our decision. So for the poor junior member going out at 3 o'clock in the morning being asked to enforce a ban bylaw, and literally they would take the heat and the flack and the earful for the decisions made far, far above them, and the community frustrations on why can't you deal with this problem? The community wants this dealt with. So in other posts I've had, it's been the most common question is how do we get to the point where the police can enforce it? My message to the First Nation is the RCMP is standing with you. We support you. We want this to happen. We just can't enforce it until there's prosecution. So we offer whatever support we can to make it happen and guidance, within our wheelhouse. But it's certainly a point of frustration and friction between the police, unfortunately, who are perceived as the face of it, and the communities.
Thank you for that. Maybe I'm gonna jump over to Mr. Wise to follow up on this, and maybe from the legal perspective, can you help us understand the challenge and potentially offer a solution to this? What would be the kind of solution from a legal perspective to get rid of the jurisdictional quagmire that I spoke of?
Of course, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll start by echoing what a lot of my justice colleagues said on Thursday, is that this really is the problem is there on how to effectively enforce and prosecute ban bylaws. Because your question goes a little bit more to the prosecution realm, I'm going to tiptoe around it a little bit and leave that to my PPSC colleagues. However, what I can say is that what goes into the operational discretion of RCMP members in enforcing ban bylaws is important, and their mandate to preserve the peace and investigate crime is paramount. And so when you get a bylaw, and to the previous witness's statement and saying in 2014 there were issues, he's referring to there was no mandatory review from Indigenous Service Canada at that point. So what you had were bylaws that perhaps did not meet constitutional muster or other problems with it that led RCMP as potentially as part of their decision making and whether to enforce it or not. It became a larger issue there. So it's quite complicated, and that's an understatement. You've been hearing that for a couple of days now. But again, with the prosecution piece, the jurisdictional quagmire between the provincial attorney generals and the federal attorney general exists. I'm no expert on that, but it definitely is a problem that requires a whole of government response.
And thank you. That brings us to time, and we go now to Mr. Batiste for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you for this. And can you hear me? Just give me a head shake. Okay. I've been listening as this conversation has evolved, and I haven't heard a lot of solutions. I heard a lot of people saying, well, it's complicated and it takes a lot of different jurisdictions. I'm wondering if there was an Indigenous Attorney General in Canada that not only looked at the constitutional realm, but also Section 35 rights, Aboriginal and treaty rights, as well as what goes on reserve. Would this not help the situation to have one authority or one voice to be able to make those decisions that need to be made in a timely, effective manner? I'll open it up.
Like that.
Mr. Chair, is that directed at me?
Anybody, go ahead.
Department of Justice. That perhaps is a viable solution. I don't know much about that potential solution, but I do think my colleague at the Aboriginal Law Center at the Department of Justice on Thursday pointed to a couple possible solutions, such as a ramp up of specific administration of justice agreements. That's something that could definitely help. You've heard from PPSC about, during the current pandemic, the short-term solutions on prosecuting COVID-related bylaws. So they are out there, but I think like a lot of people, the minister and others, shares frustration in this issue, and which is why it's important to have a conversation like this. That's all I can respond at this point. If you'd like me to follow up further, I'm happy to.
So I'm wondering when you say the minister, because it seems to fall under a number of ministerial portfolios. That seems to be one of the problems here, is that we have got the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice. We have the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. We also have the Minister of Public Safety. And at the end of the day, I'm hearing a lot of discussion about once a band makes a bylaw, there is also a discretion and national divisional policy that they have to look at. But where does the buck stop at the end of the day? Who is the person that can speed up this process to ensure that bands don't have to continue to be frustrated when the laws that they put in place to protect their community members aren't followed? So, Mr. Wise, I'll just let you go on that.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think it's passing a buck when everyone's been saying it is a shared responsibility here. I think that actually is true, and I'm here to represent the Minister of Justice personally. That's who I will be speaking for. But when you deal with police and the RCMP, and my colleagues at the RCMP can tell you that there is operational discretion, even though they are under the Minister of Public Safety. There's always police operational discretion, and so that's always a factor, and it's one of the tenets of a free and democratic society, which is an important principle to uphold. And so that will always be a factor as well. But it is complicated. It's not. There are potential solutions, and they're being worked through across departments at this time.
Can you talk to me about what the discretion is like? Give me a sense. If, let's say I'm a band, I reach out to the police and say, listen, I want to put up, blockade because COVID is become serious in my community, and certain people aren't following the blockades or the check stops, and they're driving right by our people for safety. What's the discretion that the police would have in terms of saying we're not going to follow the ban bylaw?
That one I think would be best answered by the RCMP. I'd be happy to pass it to either one of my colleagues there.
Excellent question. In fact, that has happened here in my home detachment, where all three of the First Nation communities have put up roadblocks entering into the community. Although there is no bylaw in place right now to say that these are enforceable, the RCMP has worked with each of the reserves to ensure that we will be there with them if they run into issues, and they have, where someone will try and go past the blockade. We will help. We'll stand by and keep the peace and ensure that those laws are enforced. Unfortunately, the issue is we have to stand by and keep the peace, which means we have to rely on the band representative to stand there and say, you are not welcome on reserve for whatever reason. And they are then the ones who are to tell people you have to leave. We stand in, we will stand by, and when I say keep the peace, we'll be there to ensure that that individual isn't assaulted or threatened. And if they are, then we step in, or it looks like they're about to be assaulted, then we will step in. But we don't have the legal authority to stand there ourselves and say you can't come in and enforce this bylaw, but we have to work with the community.
Thanks very much. We're way over time, and great question. I'm sorry, Mr. Batiste. Madam Berube, 2.5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Chief Preston. Do you have specific training at the RCMP to promote or foster good relationships with Indigenous people?
I would have to pass on the training that's going on at depot right now to our headquarters because it's been 25 years since I've actually gone through it. However, we do have online training here. I know nationally that each officer must take First Nations online course. One thing that I would love to see is to have members, when they do come to the community, meet with elders to learn the local customs, and meet with chief and council to come up with, or so the new officers understand what problems do exist on reserve. We do have a orientation package here at my detachment, so that when someone comes, we do give it all new members this package where it has a history that was provided by each of the communities, so that we do have something. But I think there more could be done in that way. I'm not sure if Staff Sergeant Howe, what you have at your home detachment.
No, I agree with you about integrating new members from all over Canada into the unique communities they serve. We've written that into our annual performance plan, and I believe that's a provincial mandate this year. It's so important that when they get to the community, as soon as they're on the ground, they understand and meet the local leaders and the community, so they understand who they're dealing with.
Aussi,
Do you have any recommendations to improve the support you give to Indigenous groups?
Inspector.
Sorry, just want to make sure my mic was on. Again, I think it just having, for example, our CTA communities, our community tripartite agreement communities, having enough resources for them to go into the communities to make that positive have that positive interaction. A lot of my frontline officers, the only opportunity they truly get to go on reserve is when they're responding to a call, and that's not the time to build a relationship when people are in crisis. Having our CTA First Nation members go on ahead of time, like my officer here, I have one for 3 reserves though, unfortunately, so his time is very limited on each reserve. But when he can get on reserve, that have the opportunity to make those positive interactions, especially with the youth. I can speak, for example, my officer here just last week went and worked with a grade 5 class and came up with produced 30 paddles, carving paddles, to work with the kids so they have a positive interaction with police, as opposed to the only interaction they have is when they come to arrest someone.
Thanks very much. And Ms. Blaney, 2.5.
Thank you, Chair. Inspector Preston, in your experience, what work around has the RCMP had to utilize in order to help First Nation communities with the enforcement of bylaws and/or First Nation traditional laws such as banishment, and has it been successful?
I think the one thing the RCMP is excellent at is workarounds. When there are problems within a community, we truly want to try and come up with a solution working in conjunction with community members. So, for example, when we have a banishment law that has been passed, or even if it's not been passed, there's an issue with an individual on reserve that the community wants gone, we'll stand by and keep the peace. We will work. We'll go on there proactively and speak to the individual, although we aren't necessarily able to, grab a hold and throw them off the reserve on behalf of the man, but to explain the process and help get them off in a peaceful manner. Again, it is that personal relationship that seems to work the best when the laws that are enacted aren't sufficient to do the job.
So, and that keeps coming up about those relationships. And earlier in your questions to the last, or response to the last MP, you talked about resources. And one of the challenges my interpretation of that is enough resources to have your members be able to go onto the community and have some time up there that isn't just about enforcement, but is about that connection and that connection building. So is that a challenge then? You talked about having one RCMP officer for 3 communities, and I would assume it would be a challenge to send your members up to just hang out for half an hour to get to know people. Just wondering, is that a resource issue?
There's every community or every detachment is different. Some of our smaller detachments, I've had the opportunity, a little bit more time, so I could personally go out and do that proactive work. A place like Campbell River is a much busier location, and having the time to go to the reserve is very, very limited for a lot of our officers. It's not from a lack of wanting to, it's just a lack of they've got priority calls in the queue. They have to go and respond to them. So yeah, resourcing can definitely be an issue. And again, I can only speak for the detachment areas that I've personally worked in. I don't know, I can't speak for my colleagues in Saskatchewan or elsewhere, but maybe Staff Sergeant Howe, in your experience, you could pipe in.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And even further to the relationship building, when the members are so busy and responding to calls for service and usually violent calls for service, for them to be in a mind frame, as they're people too, to be in a mind frame to go and relationship build in any spare time they have, it makes it extremely difficult. Bearing in mind that we're recovering from a pandemic and our depot was in a shutdown, so our resources are going to be thin here for a while, but absolutely resources is an issue in terms of relationship building.
Thanks very much. And Gary Vidal, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to follow up on where the conversation's been going here a little bit in the concept of relationships and communication. And sorry, obviously this is my last opportunity. I want to end it on a relatively positive note. And Staff Sergeant Howe, I know you have some stories in your own experience of some really positive things that you've been involved in personally, but also that some of your members that you've been a leader of have been involved in. And back in your time as the commanding officer of the City of Lake when I was the mayor, I know you initiated a kind of communication strategy to tell some of the good stories that the RCMP were doing in our community, so that it wasn't always about the negative things. It always wasn't about the enforcement things. And I want to give you an opportunity just to share 2 or 3 of these positive stories and how the impact of those positive stories could benefit those policing in First Nations communities, both maybe in neighboring ones to non-Indigenous communities, but also some of the more remote and northern First Nations communities.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I guess I read through Chief Blake's comments last week from the Stutena First Nation, and he made a comment about enforcement only being a very small part of our job. And I very much agree with that. There's a lot of restorative justice going on behind the scenes, and it's as simple as Mr. Vidal was saying. A few years ago, we had a Mountie from Quebec who was posted to a Northern First Nation in Saskatchewan. He had never been on a First Nation before, and he went to a powwow. And as soon as he heard the drum, he started dancing in his own way. And you may have seen it. It was national news. We had the dancing Mountie, but the fact that he let himself go and stepped outside of his professional persona, it won the community over. And it was just a simple 3 or 4 minute escape for him, I suppose. So it's things like that, the things that you don't see that are outside the enforcement. In my time in Loon Lake, we were dealing with an extremely violent gang that was terrorizing the whole side of the province, using the color red as a method to intimidate and scare the community. And I was so frustrated because kids couldn't even walk to school. They were terrified that these gangs were always out and always having firearms. So one of my young members made a comment about the color red, and he said, "We wore red first," and, hearkening back to our red tunics. And we thought, let's take that back. So we met with the community leaders and were informed that red is a very important traditional color in First Nations as well. So we said, let's take this back. Again, this is totally outside of enforcement and thinking outside the box and relationship building. And what was thought of is, let's get the community mobilized all in red and walk around and tell the gangs, no more. This is our community. And we mobilized over 350 people to walk around the community that day. So very, very impressed with the community that were willing to stand with us, and we were willing to stand with them. that had far more impact than any enforcement that could have been done. So just to reiterate the common theme that I'm hearing, it's all about relationships and the hundreds of thousands of positive contacts between the police and all communities, especially First Nations, every day that don't get noticed. So I appreciate Mr. Vidal's question and letting me get that message out there that while there's legislative barriers, it's very important to acknowledge that there's excellent work being done.
I'm going to honestly suggest I thought Staff Sergeant Howe would kill my time telling stories, but he didn't. So, Inspector Preston, can I throw that at you? And do you have a similar story to share, kind of from a positive perspective like that?
Thank you for that, the opportunity, because like Staff Sergeant Howe said, we have hundreds of thousands of interactions with the general public each day or year, and the only thing that seems to get publicized is the one or two that go negatively. There are a multitude of good stories being told throughout the province here. I can speak, I know Ms. Blaney will know, Corporal Chris Voller here, very close to my detachment, worked north end of the island here, has worked super hard with the community in Port Hardy, was basically indoctrinated into the community, was given a First Nations name, loved by all because he really truly, like I say, became part of that community. Unfortunately, when he left, it left a hole there for him, but has now gone to Quadra Island here and is working with Weewokai First Nations and started off on a great footing, trying to do some reconciliation work with the community. I could go on and on. I have an officer here when it does snow. We don't get a lot of snow on Vancouver Island, which is great. But when it does snow, he'll take out his personal snowblower and go and snowblow the elders' driveways. Things like that. I know we've had just recently, and speaking of reconciliation, brought all the detachment commanders from the island here, so to put on a One Village workshop, which, if you're not aware of, it's a workshop that's put on by an educator here from the university that outlines the impact the residential schools has had on First Nation communities, with the hope that those commanders can then turn around and take that knowledge and go to their detachments and spread it to each officer, and hopefully even bring that education to the detachment by bringing the educator there.
Thanks, Inspector. We're moving along to time, and that brings me to Ms. Zan. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have a question, and again, I would open this up to any of you to respond. But when it comes to, you had talked about drug dealers on reserve, but when it comes to the issue of selling cannabis, cannabis places opening up on reserve and selling edibles and things like this as well, how do you deal with that in your regions of the country, as this is happening here in Nova Scotia, and I know that there are mixed feelings about it on reserve by both band and council and citizens. Could you please tell me a little bit about how you deal with that in your regions? Thank you.
Unfortunately, I won't be able to answer your question on that. I don't have any experience with it. I can get our headquarters to provide you some information, though.
I'd be the same. I have no experience with that, unfortunately. I apologize.
Okay, thank you. And when it comes to the difference between acting on behalf of the province or acting on behalf of the government of Canada, again, here in Nova Scotia, the RCMP is higher. They are retained by the province in some areas, and also, as Pam, I believe, mentioned earlier, by some of the counties in others. And sometimes there is frustration when situations happen where the RCMP are seen as not really doing anything. And obviously there's enough blame to go around for everybody. So what could you explain again and a little bit more expand upon the differences between your responsibilities when it is the province that is hiring you versus the feds versus municipalities? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. Regardless of who is paying your, what we call collator, so who's funding your position, the role and responsibility of every officer is to uphold the various statutes, regardless if you're a federally funded or provincially funded or municipally funded. You're there to enforce the laws and regulations that are on the books that are enforceable. The frustration comes when, for the community, is when they see that they believe there's a law and they don't think that the police are enforcing it. Go back to my example of the Motor Vehicle Act. When it's not that we're not wanting to enforce it, there's law, there's case law that says, no, that law doesn't apply on those specific roads. That's a very difficult thing to try and explain to the general public when it's hard enough for the officers to understand and to keep straight. But regardless, I guess the short point of it, regardless of who's funding your position, your job is to uphold the various regulations.
Thank you. I'd also just like to ask about wellness checks, as there have been a number of cases where RCMP have been called to go in for a wellness check, and it has not ended well for the person. So I know you said that oftentimes it's the bad news stories that hit the media, but these are upsetting stories, definitely. And so I know that local police officers here in Nova Scotia have said they'd prefer not to go to wellness checks. They believe people who have more training in wellness and mental health issues should be going to these calls. What is your response to that, and what recommendations can you make?
And I'll let Staff Sergeant Howe here in a moment to speak. I can speak for the officers around here. We go to an awful lot of wellness checks, and I agree that it would be very nice to have a mental health worker come along with us. But unfortunately, in a lot of the rural communities that we police, we are everything for everyone. We are the mental health officer. We are, in some cases, the nurse and everything else. At 3 o'clock in the morning, there is no one else to call. So we are de facto it. So with proper training, and we do have a lot of training in this regard, we can go and deal with those situations, but I would rather not have to if I didn't have to.
And that brings us to time. And thanks very much, Ms. Zan. And thanks to all of our panelists. Another remarkable hour of testimony. I'm sure that we'll have valuable thought and recommendations coming out of your testimony today. Once again, thank you so much for being here. And we're going to suspend briefly while we change panels. Thanks, everyone. And with us is Chief Dale Cox of the Lakeshore Regional Police Service in Alberta, and our guest from Sûreté du Québec. We'll get to them hopefully when the technical issue is resolved. But for now, Chief Cox, please go ahead with 6 minutes.
Anse, bonjour. Good morning to everybody. I'm coming to you and speaking to you from Treaty 8 territory in northwestern Alberta. And I'd like to give you a little bit of history on myself and our police service. I'm about to enter my 43rd year of policing. So I've been around for a while and seen a lot of this go on. Our police service is 13 years, moving into its 13th year of operation. I spent my first 30 years with the RCMP and left the RCMP to take on the role as the first chief of police for the Lakeshore Regional Police Service and to build this police service from the ground up. I'm very proud of the men and women that work here, and I'm also very proud of the communities that have stood behind and supported First Nation policing. The issues I want to speak today about are around enforcement, but enforcement within the realm of self-administered First Nation policing. We are on the cusp of moving forward in this area that for years has been neglected and has not been fully recognized the potential of what can happen there. With the Alberta moving forward with Bill 38 last year and recognizing self-administered First Nation policing in the province, it put us on equal footing with all policing in Alberta, all municipal and the RCMP. That gave us 48% of the recognition we required. We need the other 52% of a recognition as an essential service and a true policing service, and that needs to come from the federal government, who are our 52% partners in self-administered First Nation policing. We hear that that's moving forward, but unfortunately, in all my years of policing, we've heard those things for quite a while. And I think part of what I'll share with you today is some of the stories that have come about to show the distrust and the lack of belief within the First Nations of this truly moving forward. I'll share with you a story 6 years ago that happened. The public safety minister called together everybody from First Nation policing across Canada. Our meeting was held in Alberta. There was representatives from Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia there. The minister got up, spoke for 45 to 50 minutes. Within that speech, said at least 5 times, "I'm here to listen to you and hear what it is you need." He finished speaking. He walked out of the room. I sat beside an elder. An elder looked at me and said, "I wonder if he can hear us from out there." So those are the type of things that have caused that distrust to be out there. And unfortunately, that distrust moves to the policing realm as well. But I can tell you it's taken us 12 years that we have built that trust, and we are somewhat the victim of our own success. Our calls for service and our belief that when the people call, somebody will come, has moved forward, that we are sitting with more files than we have officers to police it. Our issue right now is resourcing. I don't sleep at night because in our resourcing in our police service, I usually have one police officer working. And for everybody to understand, our area is 5 separate First Nations, and the total area is over 160 kilometers from one end to the other. And with only one police officer working, I'm asking police officers to make decisions. Which priority 1 call do they go to first? Do they go to the mental health call of somebody who's having a mental health issue and is in possession of weapons? Or do they go to the domestic dispute where somebody's being hurt and they only have one person to go and they can't split in half? And those are the issues that we've put out there. The other issue I'll share with you is a story that still bothers me to this day. Because we do not have enough resources to police for 24 hours a day, we are down for 4 to 5 hours a day where we have nobody actually working but are on call. And in a blizzardy February morning at 3:30 in the morning, we got a call of an assault and a stabbing on one of our nations. Our member was called out, defrosted his vehicle, got on the road driving through a blizzard. By the time that all happened, the ambulance was called. The ambulance works 24 hours a day. The ambulance arrived at the scene. The victim was inside, bleeding profusely. The family was outside begging the ambulance to come in and treat their son. However, the ambulance could not go in because they have policy that they can't be there without police being there in a dangerous situation. That resulted in a homicide. Those are not things I want to be able to, or how I'm able to go and justify to my communities, to my elders, or to those families. And those are the areas that First Nation policing has moved so far past what it originally came out as just poor core policing and response policing. We have the trained members, the ability, and the community confidence to be able to supply all the services that are required out there.
Chief Cox, that brings us to time. Thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Clerk, are we good to go with Captain Durand?
J'espère que oui, Capitaine.
I hope so. Can you speak for 15 seconds, Captain Durand? Yes. Does the microphone work okay this time? Can you hear me okay? Yes, we can. Captain Gay is going to begin, and I will complete the presentation. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Mariette Gay. I'm responsible for relations between municipal and Indigenous community for the Sûreté de Québec. Today, I'm going to talk about the Indigenous services in Quebec and what our our best practices are. To begin with, we have 55 Indigenous communities in Quebec. 40 of them are served by 20-odd police services in Quebec. When it comes to the QPF, we have 11 Indigenous communities. In the Indigenous communities, well, we provide the same types of services that we provide to other municipalities and other communities that are suffered by the Sûreté de Québec. It should be noted that 7 communities do have public security services, which enables us to identify issues and to determine what the priorities are when it comes to public safety and to make some recommendations to the bound councils of the communities. With respect to communities that are served by their own police forces, we do have a role to play as the provincial police service. We essentially provide assistance for operations, and we provide specialized services, or we do provide some administrative services as well. On average, we get more than 500 requests for assistance per year. At the Sûreté de Québec, we work with the various Indigenous police officers to deal with investigations, information, and surveillance. With respect to the sharing of responsibilities, the coordination, strategic is done with by the division that is responsible for Indigenous community relations. We have liaison officers that are Indigenous and officers that are deployed throughout Quebec, and some of these liaison officers who are Indigenous also work in urban areas. The role of liaison officers is to develop and maintain relationships with communities to identify the needs of the communities when it comes to public safety and to come up with solutions or adapted programs. They provide advice as to how we operate, and of course, they work as facilitators during operations or events. As for operational coordination, that's another branch that is responsible for this. This is the Emergency Measures Division. They deploy operations in situations or conflicts, and they coordinate assistance provided to the Indigenous police services. It's important to specify that the police services provided to 11 Indigenous communities are provided by local police detachments. I would now like to talk about the Indigenous services that live outside the community. You know, there are several towns that have a large Indigenous population, and they are covered by the Sûreté de Québec. These towns get the assistance of liaison officers and Indigenous liaison officers. They work on a regular basis with the other members in this communities. We ensure that there is accessible services for Indigenous people living in urban areas. We also have established joint teams. These teams are joint intervention teams to serve the community, and we have already 2 that have been established over the next 3 years. We intend to establish 4 other intervention teams, and these teams include community intervention polices, and we deal with intervention issues for vulnerable communities. In addition, we have the service in Val-d'Or, where my colleague Captain Durand can talk to you about the establishment of this wonderful initiative. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, and members of the community. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, and members of the Standing Committee on Indigenous Affairs. My name is Captain Robert Durant. I'm Director of the Val-d'Or RCM Service Center. I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about what we've been done in Val-d'Or in order to promote better relationships with the Indigenous communities and the general public. For several years, the Val-d'Or has been dealing with various social problems, including the presence of a vulnerable community and impacted by drug addiction, mental health issues, poverty, and homelessness. With this vulnerable community also includes Indigenous people. Starting in 2015, the Sûreté de Québec began to come up with alternative solutions to provide public safety, intervene with the Indigenous community, and to help vulnerable people. We've participated in initiatives to come up with alternative sustainable solutions that meet with the cultural needs of the Indigenous peoples. The people in Val-d'Or have benefited from this. In November, we had our first intervention team set up. We have set up a joint team, what we call the MIMIC. At that time, the team had a social worker, a police officer from the Sûreté de Québec. The MIMIC was set up to help people who had already had repeat offenses or interventions with the police service. The target population was vulnerable, often had drug and mental health issues, and they were often homeless. The role of MIPIC is to intervene on the second line when the situation involves vulnerable people who are addicted or at risk of becoming so. We also try to take a community approach that's tailored to their needs. When necessary, we get involved. We refer people to social workers. We try to prevent crimes from occurring and create and try and avoid situations that may be dangerous. We meet the needs of vulnerable people in the territory. In November 2016, the QPF announced a pilot project, the PPCMA, which is established in Val-d'Or. Since then, we have seen an increased, a better relationship with public service communities. We've come up with alternative solutions that meet the values and the culture of the Val-d'Or Indigenous population, and we're closer with the citizens now. The philosophy of these teams is to work in partnership and to provide good communication. We coordinate operations with them to provide essential services. We want to really take a community approach based on the needs of this vulnerable population. The interventions are targeted and they are sustainable. We have a common objective, the needs of the people. We have set up an EPIC approach, and we take targeted action on upstream. We are proactive, and we complement traditional patrol services, and we try to funnel vulnerable people to the services that they need. In June 2016, we were officialized, and we are now a permanent service in Quebec. We have 11 police officers, 4 social workers, and we work in collaboration with the Temiskaming Center. Since 2018, we have had an Indigenous police officer who is working with us, and he's been working with the Anishinaabe people. These people have really improved the services that we can provide, but due to a lack of resources, this came to an end in 2020. Everyone is affected by this lack of resources. By working in partnership and being aware of Indigenous culture, we have seen a real difference in our community. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity and for explaining what our team's done. And we also have some videos on YouTube. I would invite you to look at them and see what we've been able to do for our communities. Thank you very much.
For your testimony. Now, members of committee, because we were late getting started, I'll need a motion to extend the meeting past the hour of 1 o'clock. Also, there are a number of constraints on many of us following up. I'm on house duty and have other duties coming up. So I'm going to suggest that we do the full 6-minute round and a bit of a shorter round on the 5-minute round. And so if I could have a motion to extend beyond 1 o'clock. Thank you. Ms. Blaney moves, seconded. Madame Berube, merci. So we'll move now to the 6-minute round of questioning, starting with Mr. Viersen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Cox, thank you for showing up on such short notice. The crux of the issue that we're trying to get at is specifically the enforcement of ban-specific laws for that might be different or might be specific to a particular community. I'm wondering if you've got any examples of that and how you deal with those, and also around just perhaps the prosecution of those, and is there some sort of mechanism that is community specific, like a community court or community tribunal of sorts for redress of these issues? Mr. Cox.
Thank you. Yes, in all the years of my First Nation policing, this has always been an issue. The ban bylaw is looked at. A bylaw is basically the bottom end of the legal system. You start with your Charter of Rights and Freedoms, go through your federal statute, provincial statutes, you get to your bylaws, which is mostly evolved in municipal policing. In First Nation policing, they look at the ban bylaws as well. They absolutely have the right under the Indian Act to enact them. The problem falls in, as everybody has said before, in the prosecution. Even with the Indian Act, the federal statute, I have taken it at least on 3 occasions to 3 different public service or public safety prosecution people that were assigned to Alberta to see if they would prosecute things like trespass under the Indian Act. And all 3 of them had told me it's not a priority and they would need further direction from Ottawa before they would utilize resources for prosecutions under the Indian Act. So that was sort of a non-starter there. So what I've done in working with our First Nations is when we talk about ban bylaws, we have to sit down and first of all say, what is it that you want to achieve from this? And from that, possibly I can find another way to get around that. So either provincial or federal prosecutors will have to take it on because it can be applied from another statute federally or provincially. In some cases, that's not possible. So the nations, I have one nation that has started bylaws and they've committed to fund the prosecution of those bylaws because there is no one else. And I have to be able to, before I lay a charge, know that due process will take place. So that there are areas in there that are a problem. We do utilize the Indian Act for things like trespass. We lay the charge. We release on long form information with conditions that they have to meet until they get to court. And then if they breach those conditions, now we can rely on the criminal code. But yes, it still is a problem, and it is. I think a possible solution is an overall look at a First Nations justice system where the actual crux of what we're trying to get to and the results we're trying to get can be resolved on the nations itself.
Yeah, that's precisely what I was going at. Is that a possibility for them to have their own court or tribunal, right? But that would be self-administered, I suppose. That would be their own essential justice system. That's kind of what you're saying?
Within First Nations, they have a right to self-governance. Self-governance should include a justice system. First Nations aren't saying they want to leave Canada, they want to leave all of this. What they're saying is, we recognize we have problems within our nations. We also know how to fix them. Let us fix them. We will stay within your framework somewhat, but some of that framework has been going on for over 100 years and hasn't worked. Maybe take a look at something different. And that's restorative justice practices, cultural, traditional type of things to address it. And what it has to come out to is that all parties agree, this is not right, this is what's wrong, this is what needs to be fixed, and now how do we move forward and go from there? I met with all my board of chiefs 2 weeks ago, and they now want to start serious conversations with the federal government for the next move in our justice system. The first was our police service. We're concrete, we're established. Now they want to move to the next steps of the justice system, have their own courts, have their own prosecutions, have their own ability to set laws that can work within their nations.
Okay. The I guess they're just part of it is that I'm running a little bit blind on this. Is there one area that perhaps we haven't considered, but you would say, hey, this is something that your study should include, that we're struggling with? So we're maybe blind to something. I was wondering if you have any other suggestions.
The one I'll have, and it deals with all First Nations policing and basically First Nations and dealing with First Nations. They are not all the same. Every First Nation has their own issues and they want to discuss those issues. They don't want somebody else to speak for them. 3 months ago, I was on a conference call with federal ministers that was asked for by the First Nation chiefs of the province of Alberta. And one of the things that came out from all of the chiefs on there is, if you want to talk to us about our justice system, about our policing, come and talk to us. Don't talk to the Assembly of First Nations. They don't represent us. Talk to us, because we each have individual cares that can be addressed and are probably simple to fix, but you got to come talk to us, or you're bringing us solutions to problems we don't have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cox.
Just about time there, Mr. Viersen. Thank you. And Mr. Pulowski, 6 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to be quoting from, there's a website I found, Altius Clear Townsend website. It's a legal firm which does a lot of work with Indigenous communities. So they talk specifically about this issue of bylaw enforcement. First Nations. So let me just cite from them. It says, well, because I think it's a good summary, while Section 81 of the Indian Act allows bands to make on-reserve bylaws in areas including traffic control, residency, public health, and intoxicants, and while some of these bylaws can include penalties such as fines or imprisonment, the Indian Act does not specify whether the province, territories, federal government, or First Nations themselves are responsible for prosecuting bylaw infractions. Lack of federal and provincial territorial coordination or leadership on this issue has led to a situation where oftentimes neither federal nor provincial territorial levels of government are choosing to prosecute these bylaws. I'm thinking Chief Cox is the one to address this too. You've been doing this for 40 years. I hear a lot of frustration both from the Indigenous community and the police services about not enforcing the bylaws. Now, this law firm makes some suggestions, and you've been around, Chief Cox, long enough to maybe to know about this. What about Section 107 courts? So under the Indian Act, the federal government has the power through Section 107 to create federally appointed justices of peace for the prosecution of bylaws on reserve under Section 107, which I looked, and it's really there. In 2004, the Harper government halted the practice of appointing Section 107 justices of the peace. The federal government has never resumed this practice. They also suggest the possibility of these bylaws being prosecuted by the province. Apparently in Ontario, that was the case, but funding was removed for that. The federal government could reinstate Section 107 courts. Do you have any familiarity with those? I mean, why aren't I've heard and I understand your other suggestions, but there seems in the Indian Act there is a mechanism which we're not using. Do you have any comment on those courts?
I can't say I'm not 100% familiar with that, but what you said makes sense. And I do see a lot of bylaws being dealt with through a justice of the peace type of format, as opposed to provincial or federal court judges, which are tied up, as we all know, with more serious and more cases. However, this could be dealt with that way. I also see, and again, this is something that needs some research, the possibility of going back to where we did when I started policing 40 some years ago. And on minor provincial statutes, and in this case, maybe bylaws, the police themselves prosecuted those. So we didn't have to have a prosecutor. We brought police in to prosecute, and the courts or the justice made sure that the process was fair and that it followed the parts of law that needed to be followed and that a decision was rendered. So those are areas that we may have to look at. And I know our nations want a full justice system, but this may be a start of how we get started in showing that nations can police and run their own courts and look after their justice systems within their nations.
So this has been a very interesting day. We've heard about problems of unclear jurisdiction. We've also heard about things like on reserve that would make it more complicated. For example, when there's a conflict between the Wildlife Act and treaty rights. We've also heard from one of the RCMP people about even enforcing road traffic safety laws. It's different on one road versus another road. And then we heard about operational discretion of the RCMP in enforcing laws. We heard about the administration of justice agreements to allow agreements between the First Nation communities and the PPSC about prosecuting bylaws. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I look at this, I just kind of throw up my hands and say, this is just too damn complicated. Like you can't even start to act because there's so many different laws. Now, I know you can't change the Constitution, and we're probably not going to change the Indian Act, but say you could. I asked both of you. I know you have to do your job. It should be a lot easier for you to do your job without having to deal with this unbelievable complexity kind of handcuffing you and what you can do. What would be your suggestions if you were in Parliament? That what would you change to make this easier? And I can ask that, I guess, to both police services here.
Well, we only have a minute left, so go ahead, Chief.
First of all, I don't want to be in Parliament. Secondly, yes, there is solutions. Instead of finding, we always look to why we can't do something. Let's find out what we can do. It may not be the Cadillac version, but maybe it is something that still moves us forward. And a lot of times, people don't want a complete pound of flesh. They just want to be listened to. They want to be heard, and they want to know that what their thoughts are is right. And let's find a resolution as opposed to an enforcement and a punishment.
Thanks for that, Chief. And now we go to Madame Bérubé, 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for participating today. And also, I would like to that I have a question for Captain Durand. You talked about the service that was provided. You talked about the benefits for the community that you serve in Val-d'Or. The question is for me, but perhaps Captain Gay would be in a better position to answer that question because she looks after the overall territory. Yes, thank you for your question, Ms. Bérubé. As I was saying earlier, in Indigenous communities, we provide services similar to those that we provide to other towns covered by the SQ. We provide community policing, and the services provided are, well, we have a 24-hour patrol system. We answer any requests from citizens seeking help. We enforce statutes and bylaws in the communities. We do crime prevention. We deal with community relations. We conduct police investigations in various fields. The interventions in situations involving or emergency measures, for example, or operations, rescue operations, search and rescue operations. And of course, when I talked about community patrolling, we're really talking about getting closer to the citizens, to get out of the box a little bit and participate in community activities that are organized by the bands, organized by schools. So we try to really be close to our citizens. I have another question for you. You talked about the community mixed police stations. Where will the new police stations, where will these new PMAs be located right now? Well, the first one we had was in 2015. This was the community mixed police station that Captain Durand talked to you about. Right now, we are establishing a second mixed police station on the North Shore. As I said, we're just setting it up right now, but we're working with the Innu community and as well as with the Integrated Social Services Center. This PPCMA will intervene in the Sept-Îles area. For those who are not familiar with this area, we will be dealing with quite a variety of people in this center. According to our current protocol, the Indigenous Police Service of Wet'suwet'en was not able to participate in the project due to a lack of staff, but they hope to be able to participate in the years to follow. As for the next mixed police stations, well, we are going to be serving Barrier Lake and Maniwaki, which is in the Outaouais area. We now drafting a protocol, a memorandum of understanding, which will involve the SQ, social services, and the Barrier Lake community. With this team, we decided to, as my colleague explained earlier, we're going to be able to work on an integrated basis, and we're going to act as second-line responders. And so we're going to have someone who's going to able to accompany people in Barrier Lake, which is quite close to Maniwaki. This team will be integrated. There will be a fourth person joining this team, which will be an Indigenous liaison officer to serve Barrier Lake. This individual will be designated by the band in Barrier Lake and will act as a facilitator with the various resources, with the Band Council, with the families of vulnerable individuals, and any organization that would be there. So then, for over the next 3 years, we will have the Roberval police station that will be set up. They have a very high Indigenous population there, and in Babejuan and also in Metchawetch. Once again, we're going to look at the needs of the local community. We're going to work in partnership with the social services and health. We're going to work with the Indigenous people there. But there will also be a liaison officer that will come from one of the two communities, either Achimit or Ochabachuach. So the goal is to provide services that are respect the culture, respect the values, and in the way that they live on a daily basis. The third mixed police station will be in Abushimo on the North Shore. Shibogamo will use the Roberval and Maniwaki model, but their special feature is that in terms of Shibunkamu, there is a high concentration of people who come from Ijibujimu or West Wapipi, which are part of the Cree Nation. But there are also members from Bejuan. So once again, we're going to be using the same resources.
That brings us to Ms. Blaney, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank all of you for your testimony today. It's been incredibly informative. If I could start with you, Chief Cox, I'm just trying to understand. You talked about the services that you deliver and the fact that you have I think I heard you say a 4-hour window where you don't have anyone, just folks that are on call. I'm just wondering can you explain where that gap is? Is it a tripartite agreement? And where is that gap? Because that seems like a fairly significant gap. And of course, the example that you gave us of somebody, in harm's way and the ambulance workers not being able to get in there to help was just tragic. So if you could just explain, where is that gap?
The gap comes through our policing agreement that is 52% federally from the First Nation policing program and 48% from the Alberta Solicitor General. So for whatever reason, I have no idea, and they can't explain to us how they arrive at how many police officers we need. A random number is set, and that is what we are given. It isn't tied to our crime stats, which is now based on crime severity. Our crime severity in our rating in my area is 4 times higher than the federal and 3 times higher than the provincial levels are. And what that means is not that we have a dangerous place, but that when we take on these investigations, they are very complex and they are going to take a lot of hours of work and dedication from police officers to follow through from one end to the other to do the right type of investigation. So for whatever reason, we haven't got that. It talks about in our agreement there being a negotiation period. We this year will enter into our 8th amendment to our agreement, which has been a 1-year extension of the agreement. And in the 13 years I've been here, there has never been negotiation between the police commission, the board of chiefs, and the police service with the funding partners, federally or provincial, to discuss any of the areas of the agreement that we usually get at the 11th hour and said either sign it or you won't have funding for next year and your police service will be dissolved. So those are the areas, and the board of chiefs have said enough is enough. This year, when it came to me with the agreement, we stipulated to them that we would sign the amendment in order to keep the police service and the safety for our communities in place. However, we requested the federal government, the First Nation Policing Program, give us a commitment to seriously meet and negotiate a long-term agreement before the end of the second fiscal quarter. I have a letter from them. I don't know what extent that is going to be. I presented it to the chiefs. They said, fine, but we really don't believe anything will come of it. They just did this to make us happy and get us to sign the agreement. So that's where we're not a one size fits all. And what happens is, if everybody recalls, 3 years ago, the federal government came up with extra positions for First Nation policing. That was rolled out. We got out of those, we've got 2, which brought us up to 13 or 15 members. We did not receive, because of the 48% not being a position to fund it. 3 years ago, those positions were announced and given to us. I finally received the funding for it last January that I could go and hire those 2 extra members. So it's been a year and a half, nearly 2 years since the funding was announced and we actually got to hire the bodies to put on the street, and they're in training right now. So there's a disconnect there that we have to be able to have it understood that it's not one size fit all. Just because you got this much money, the idea isn't just to randomly put it out so it goes equal to everybody. I think what has to be looked at is where's the need? And the need has to, first of all, address public safety, then officer safety. Once those 2 are addressed, let's look at the other programs that we can put out there to help establish. But those are the first 2 that we need to. We are a public service. That means service to the public. But if we don't have those numbers to give, we can't. And it's cost me members. I've burnt out my members. In the last year and a half, the RCMP has recruited 6 of my officers away from me because my officers were wore out. They never got time off. If they went home on their time off, they were called back to work on one of these call-outs or to back up that single member that was working. And they just said, my family life isn't there and I'm wore out. I'll go work for somebody else who, when I'm off duty, I'm off duty. I can fix my situation. Give me 4 more policemen and I can solve all my problems. That's $800,000 a year. And I can solve my problems and put 24-hour policing plus extra programs into my police service.
So I guess, I'm from BC, and one of the things that the RCMP and my riding have challenges with is enforcing the various statutes, regulations, and of course the bylaws or laws in First Nations communities. I'm just wondering if you guys face similar challenges.
We face challenges, all charges. I've had to sit down especially when every 2 years we have a new election, you have new chief and council members, to explain things to them how the law works. It's not to say we can't do it, but here's what our challenges are. And once they get a grasp on that, then it's okay, how do we work together to get where we need to go? And need to go doesn't necessarily mean enforcement and charging people. It means getting resolution.
Thanks, Chief Cox. That brings us to time, and we go now to the 5-minute round of questions. Mr. Schmale, Jamie, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, witnesses, for your testimony here today. I think I'll pick up with Chief Cox if I could. Chief, where does your police service overlap with that of any provincial service, maybe the RCMP in Alberta, that kind of thing?
The RCMP are our neighbors in all of our non-Indigenous communities around us. So we share the highway with 3 different RCMP detachments. We have a very good working relationship at the frontline level. We have a gentleman's agreement between all the detachment commanders of those 3 detachments and my police service. We're all on the same radio system. And when there is a call for service, emergency service, where somebody's life is in danger, it doesn't matter what color the stripe is on your uniform, that police officer will get there, preserve safety until the police service of jurisdiction gets there, and we work very well together in those areas. However, in my First Nation area, the First Nations come to me and they're very much aware if the RCMP should come into their nations, and it comes from a history of not good relationships with the RCMP, that they come to me and I'll get a phone call at my office saying, why are the RCMP on our nation? And then we'll explain where it is. But the RCMP understand that First Nations have said, we want our own police service, so that's who should be there. Now they want it resourced so that it can do all the jobs. But right now, I have to call on the RCMP for specialized services. And in some cases, homicides, I had a fatal hit and run. It took 8 hours for the RCMP to get here. So those are areas that we need to expand on. But on the front line, the day-to-day work, our officers in the RCMP back each other up and support each other as best we can.
Okay, so let's talk about that relationship you have with the First Nations, if I could. Is there a local police board that you have with the representation from the communities?
Yes, our police service has jurisdiction, primary jurisdiction on 5 separate First Nations within our area, and each of those nations has assigned a police commission member. So they have a person from that commission who is not an elected official, who sits on the police commission and has oversight and governance of our police service, and to follow the agreement, meet the Alberta Police Act and the Alberta policing standards, and hold the chief of police to account to make sure those are being done.
Is your department or any in the surrounding area using any restorative justice initiatives in your practice?
Oh my goodness. This has been a bone of contention. The restorative justice program was put under, funding for it was put under the jurisdiction of the Board of Chiefs. Unfortunately, the Board of Chiefs have enough other things to do. They aren't able to oversee it. In the 12 years that we've been here, we've been through 9 different restorative justice directors. All of it has failed. And it comes down from a lack of understanding of what the restorative justice process is about and skilled and qualified people to fill those roles. Unfortunately, from the policing side, we've led that charge to try and get up there. It is a valuable asset. It's going to help us resolve matters much quicker and keep Indigenous people out of the correction system. However, we need the justice side to be on it. It's part of the justice system. It's not part of the police system. And I would like to see justice step up in the province or even federally and give proper training and proper direction to these people, and then screen them to do the job that we need to do. Our police officers, our communities are screaming for this service, and we can't get it.
I like what you said about keeping keeping the root causes and fixing and helping those communities. So how you just mentioned one about the justice. How else would you fix this? You said there's some problems. How would you fix that?
I would like to see at the very least provincial policy and standards for what the restorative justice system will do, can do, and an accounting and auditing for it to show that it is meeting those, and proper training and assessment and evaluation on a regular basis of the people that are there, and possibly even building to credentials for people to fill a restorative justice position.
Okay. Are you using, I know you just mentioned resources are tight as they are. If you have time, are you using a community liaison officer, or if you have funding, would you use that? You said with 800,000, you could solve some problems. Would that include that if you don't already have it?
The province does fund us for a crime prevention worker, which is basically a community liaison. That's a civilian person, so we don't need a badge packing, gun toting person. They go out, set up our meetings, do a lot of stuff. We put out our monthly newsletter. We talk about all the things. It goes to all the nations. We talk about what's going on. We've just started in our newsletter adding our new cadets that are in training to introduce them. We also need the community mobilization hub program rolled out. We're going to prevent crime instead of solve it, and that's where we should be going.
Thanks very much. And Mrs. Zann, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for the testimony so far. This has been extremely interesting. I do have a question for the SQ regarding the Vienne Commission. So in September of 2019, the Vienne Commission final report was released in reaction to the allegations of abuse of 10 Indigenous women by police officers from the Sûreté de Quebec assigned to Val d'Or between 2002 and 2015. And that commission's report was put forward asking for 142 calls for action. So could witnesses please provide the committee with an update on the progress of the implementation of the Vienne Commission recommendations? For example, has there been a review of the ethics complaint process? And also with regards to calls for action number 37, which is asking for setting up a mixed intervention patrols, which is police officers and community workers for vulnerable persons, both in urban environments and in the First Nations communities and Inuit villages. Could you please give us an update on how that's going? Thank you. Anybody from the SQ?
Madam Gay.
Mr. Durand or Madam Gay? I could start by saying that yes, our efforts have been focusing on community mixed patrols. As we explained earlier, we will also be deploying 4 new teams next year and in the years to come in order to interfere with these vulnerable people who have needs and need to be referred to adequate resources. With respect to the mixed police station, that's perhaps Captain Durand could talk about the actions that have been taken in Val d'Or. Exactly. That's exactly the model that has been put forward. We have patrollers and community workers that are part of this mixed police station that conduct patrols jointly. And we're not just talking about community workers. We have other Indigenous people from Anishinaabe who are wearing uniform that are part of this. They're in our SQ vehicles. Actually, we have a van that is dedicated to PPCMA. So that is the model that we have been using in Val d'Or, and we also intervene sporadically in other communities that we support when there is a need. For example, we go to the Asakik community. We have helped people with interventions, and we share our knowledge as well with these police officers who are Indigenous. If I may, one of the recommendations that came out of the Vienne Commission was to tell our police officers about Indigenous reality. So we now have a program in place, and as soon as we get a new recruit who joins the SQ, we have a training program that helps them understand the reality. The first stage is as soon as they join the SQ, they meet with people from my unit who explain the community to them, because so this is a first step to integrate and teach police officers about Indigenous culture. We also have an online program that's mandatory for all new recruits. And once again, all members of the SQ, both civilian and police officers, have to take it. Thirdly, once the recruit joins his or her detachment, we have a real immersion into the community, the Indigenous community, and they will meet. Indigenous people will come and meet with the recruit. They'll bring them to the community, introduce them to the key members of the band, and they meet with social workers, various members of the community, to really help these new recruits understand the reality. So that leads to interventions that are much safer. We also provide a 2-day training program where SQ members have more technical training on culture, on concepts with respect to the First Nations. We talk about the residential schools. On the second day, we have individuals who talk to us about Indigenous realities and how they perceive policing service so that our officers get a better understanding of the reality of people coming from these communities, how they see us, and how they can improve practices. And the last stage is the training offered to people who are working at the detachment. We talk about Indigenous women. We're developing training specific to that issue. And this will be a program that will apply to all of SQ. We provide training on Indigenous people living in urban areas. And we really like to emphasize that. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Yep,
We're
thank
over
you.
time. Moving along, Madame Berube, 2.5.
Ms. Berube, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question will be for Captain Durand. What kind of successes have the PPCMA had? We've had several success stories since our team has been implemented. We are helping people who were homeless get secure housing. We've accompanied them and helping them keep their house, pay their rent. Also, we've created ties with the community and people who were once homeless and who were vulnerable and created problems. Well, they have now rebonded with their community. And now we have now been able to send some people back to their communities. Also, one of our big success stories as a PPCMA is with the community that has a lot of interveners who are dealing with various problems that we experience in Val-d'Or. So these people are brought into our station. They discuss about the problems of people so that we can come up with a sustainable solution for both the individual and the society. So they try and look after these individuals. The group is responsible for them, but another success is that we have a psychiatrist that works from the health center. He saw what we were doing, and he offered to come and provide some presentations when he discusses cases. When we discuss cases, he listens to what we're saying, and then he makes a decision as to whether, well, bring the person to me. I'll assess a person, see if it's a mental health issue, diagnose what the problem is, and if that's the case, he provides treatment. Another success we've had is we've got Indigenous people who are working in our police station, people from the First Nations. And we thank the community for sending us these individuals. They understand the reality of Indigenous communities and they help us understand how a community operates. They also gave us the tools that will enable us to better provide services to people. Sometimes it's just using a keyword. So for keywords in Anishinaabe, so that we can create some type of a tie with these people.
And Ms. Blaney, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. And if I could come back to you, Chief Cox, one of the things that you talked about in your presentation to us was the discussion that's happening within the communities that you serve of funding the prosecution themselves. We heard from previous testimony that this has been a challenge for a lot of Indigenous communities because the cost is so prohibitive. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about what that might look like and what sort of plans are happening in the communities you serve to plan for that.
Yes. Because of the cost restrictions of having to hire their own lawyer to prosecute any of these offenses, of my 5 First Nations, I've only had one, and they've only stepped forward to deal with access to the nation, people they don't want on there, and banning them from there and putting a bylaw in place for that. We work together on this. We have an agreement and a partnership that if they find somebody, we will talk to them. Most of them are drug dealers that they find are an issue and probably are not band members, but are living on the nation or coming onto the nation. So what we will do then is, if we don't have the grounds to prosecute them for the actual offense, we can prosecute them under the bylaw for being on the nation. There was a band council resolution passed. Notice was served upon those people that they were not to be there. And if they do come in, then we charge them. We then work with the band to relay the charges to them so they can move them on to their band lawyer, who will prosecute them at the band's expense. So far, we've only had one of those happen. Most of it has worked through us taking the band council resolution to the offending party, serve it to them, and advising them that if they do come back on, here's what you will be facing.
Well, that's really helpful. I guess the last question that I have for you is do you have any experience in the nations that you serve enforcing any traditional laws, such as you talked about banishment, and has it been successful with those traditional laws?
Yes. I was raised amongst First Nation people, and I know how important family is to First Nation. And to ban somebody, remove them from their family, from access to their family living on the nation, is a very, very severe step to take. So it's taken very seriously amongst First Nation people. And it's the last step that we'll take. And that's why programs like community mobilization, the HUB program, restorative justice, those are areas that we need to address and move forward through to hopefully get to where we don't have to banish, we find another way of fixing the problem.
Chief Cox, thank you so much, Captain Durand, Captain Gay. And I'm sure that the testimony that you've provided today will assist us in resolving so many of the issues that concern us with regard to policing. And once again, thanks for your attendance today. Members, on Thursday, we have our regular meeting with witnesses from 11 till 1, and then the extra 1-hour meeting with additional enforcement witnesses in the evening from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. And with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Ms. Blaney, Mr. Pulowski, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.